This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting episode 9 of season 1 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Robert Carter. Dr. Robert Carter has a Bachelor of Science degree in Applied Biology with high honors from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Ph.D. in Marine Biology from the University of Miami. Dr. Robert Carter is a former high school science teacher who taught AP Biology, Chemistry, Physics, and Electronics at Darlington School, a private American college preparatory day and boarding school in Rome, Georgia. Dr. Robert Carter has been awarded Maytag Doctoral Fellowship by the University of Miami and Fellowship from the Institute for Marine Science. His dissertation was on cnidarian fluorescent proteins, and he has designed and constructed an aquaculture facility for Caribbean corals. Dr. Carter has been featured in numerous documentaries, like Darwin, The Voyage That Shook the World, Dragons or Dinosaurs, Alien Intrusion, Patterns of Evidence, and one of which he came up with the original concept for and co-produced, the world-renowned Evolution's Achilles Heels, which has won awards at Christian film festivals. Dr. Carter is also published in several scientific journals, like Theoretical Biology, Medical Modeling, Nucleic Acid Research, Comparative Biochemistry and Physiology, and Marine Biology. Dr. Carter hosts a podcast of his own called Equinox, striking the balance between the light and the dark, and is the founder of Biblical Genetics. Besides being a scientist of the highest academic rank, Dr. Robert Carter is also a devout Christian who loves Jesus Christ and preaches the gospel message. Now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Robert Carter. How is your day and how are you doing?
Good morning, Christopher. I'm doing very well. I'm a little humbled by your introduction there.
Amen. Now, since this is Current Topics in Science, we will quickly look at this week's current topic. According to ScienceNews.com, marine biologists find coral gardens in deep-sea canyons off Australia. Dr. Julia Trotter, who is the chief scientist from the University of Western Australia, led the expedition, and she and her colleagues collected deep-sea corals and made some remarkable discoveries. Dr. Trotter said, "The vertical cliffs and ridges support a stunning array of deep-sea corals that often host a range of organisms and form numerous mini ecosystems," end quote. According to Dr. Montaga, co-chief scientist from the Institute of Polar Sciences in Italy, a particular species of solitary cup coral was found during the expedition. According to Science News, the implications for this research are important because it will help scientists to, quote, trace changes in water masses forming around Antarctica and dispersing northward into Indian and other oceans. Dr. Carter, what do you think of this current topic, and does it have any implications for the creation model?
The presence of deep water corals is a fascinating subject, and they're not just found off of Western Australia. They're actually found all over the world. There's extensive beds north of Scotland, actually. But the deep water corals aren't quite the same as the shallow water corals people are familiar with. You know, the Great Barrier Reef and the Barrier Reef in the Caribbean, places like that. There's beautiful pictures you see in scuba diving magazines. The deep water corals, they don't have any algae inside them, so they don't actually photosynthesize like the shallow water corals do. And they don't tend to be as robust and bulky. They tend to be spindly, small, but they can develop into vast fields across extensive muddy bottoms in deep waters. They are interesting in a lot of ways. And one of the things that's happening now, though, is that we're starting to study them more intensely. And we're learning there's a lot more species there than we thought. There's a lot more ecological interactions than we thought. And because they typically, at least some of the species, they grow slowly. If you take the skeleton, you can get a chemical record of the ocean water over long periods of time. So they might be able to be used as environmental indicators for all sorts of global processes. Is that nerdy enough for you?
That's perfect. Actually, that leads into our next question. In your experience studying corals and other marine life, you've made well over 500 scuba dives. When you were a guest speaker at Calvary Chapel in Delray Beach, Florida, you said that you went scuba diving for the first time in the year 1993. Now, this is a twofold question. What are some interesting experiences you've had scuba diving, and what is your favorite sea creature?
Oh my! After that many dives, it would be really hard to pick out a favorite, but I have tons of experiences. My first ever open water dive was in June in Belize before the rainy season had kicked in, and literally it was like jumping into a sea of glass. In
Wow.
fact, 600 scuba dives later, I've never seen water as clear as my first dive. I got spoiled really quickly. I got to spend a month on a remote island in the Bahamas. That was really nice. I've done a lot of night diving, specifically in my lab. We were looking at coral reproduction and the reef building corals in the Caribbean. Most of them spawn, as in they release millions of eggs into the water all of a sudden, 3 hours after sunset, 3 nights after the full moon in August. Figure that one out. Actually, it took people a long time to figure that out, but once they realized what the timing was, we went down there year after year after year and got to do night diving during coral spawning season, and it was beautiful and amazing, and so all sorts of weird things in the water. I actually got to do a snorkel in the Galapagos Islands, and I snorkeled with probably about 1,000 hammerhead sharks. I think. Oh, we were at a volcanic cone that sticks up out of the ocean, and it had split. And the boat dropped us off on one side. It might have been 100 meters wide, maybe. And we swam through it, maybe, I don't know, a couple 100 meters long. And we get to the other side, the bottom just dropped straight down into the abyss. I mean, dark blue, black water. And I noticed there was a shark down there. And then I noticed another and another and another. And I said, I wonder. So I took a breath. So I was younger then and much better at holding my breath. I went down about 50 feet and just hovered. The sharks are all about 60 feet. And I just looked and they just disappeared into the gloom. There are so many sharks and they're all pointing into the current, just sitting there, waiting for something to float by to eat, I guess. But that was really amazing. And I would love to do that again.
And so would you say that your favorite is the hammerhead?
No, that was just a neat experience. My favorite animal ever probably is a cuttlefish.
Wow. Why the cuttlefish?
Because they're cool, they move weird, they change colors, they flash colors. They're just really, really, really interesting, very intelligent things. We're told they're related to clams somehow, but anyway, um, they're just amazing mollusks. I should probably say my favorite is a coral, but when you get a doctorate in that subject and you spend so much time studying something, yeah, I know an awful lot about them, and they're amazing, and I could talk forever about the details. But I think the cuttlefish is probably my favorite.
Hopefully someday we'll get to see some of these sea creatures, like when God makes the earth new, and maybe he'll have some of these creatures there, all in their full glory.
I'm assuming so, and we're going to be surprised, I bet, when we see the diversity and the creative genius of God in the new creation. Looking forward to it,
Amen.
actually.
Amen. Now, speaking of heaven, and speaking of morality and God, Dr. Carter, you helped develop new protocols for the rapid cloning of fluorescent protein genes. You and a coworker created transgenic zebrafish by taking green and red fluorescent proteins from hard and soft corals. In a talk you gave at the Calvary Baptist Church, you said in relation to the Frankenfish experiments, quote, That opens up a giant can of worms, doesn't it? Is this moral? End quote. Now, is what you've done to these fish moral or immoral?
Well, I ask it that way because genetic engineering is a up and coming new technology that everyone in the world is going to have to wrestle with. And Christians specifically, we're going to have to ask some very difficult questions. And it would be nice if we had answers for some of those questions. Now, being that God put Adam and Eve on this earth as caretakers, as stewards of his creation, he told them to um, take care of the earth and subdue it. I think that dominion mandate that was given to Adam and Eve applies to us also. And since fish are under our dominion, I have no problem with genetically engineering a fish to do something important. And actually, what my lab was doing when I left in 2003, when I got my doctorate, they were taking my genes and putting them next to genes in the fish that were only expressed when the fish was exposed to a toxic metal like zinc, and the fish would just brighten up and turn green. And they also put it next to a gene that's called a heat shock protein. So when the fish was stressed, it would turn green. The problem with that one was there was always a little bit this gene being expressed, so the fish was always at least a little bit green. What they were trying to do is develop a cancer model where a tumor, if the fish developed a tumor, it would be green, and when it was cured, it would stop being green. So it's a direct application to human health there, and I actually think that was wonderful because the cool thing about green fluorescent proteins is that you can see them. And it's like the only gene that has a visible product, an obviously visible product. And it makes a really neat biomarker that you can study in living things and you can do all sorts of things with it. And fluorescent proteins actually have a huge range of biotechnological applications, and they are improving human health over the long term. So one thing scientists often do is they'll work out a protocol using a green fluorescent protein because it's so easy to see. And once they said, okay, 99% of our cells have this green fluorescent protein, let's try this other technique and put in this gene that we can't see, but we're pretty sure that it's going to work because we know it works when we use the thing we can see. This is a really cool tool. So is it moral? Yeah, I think so. I think it's very moral. I mean, I have no problem eating a fish. I don't know why I would have a problem genetically manipulating a fish. Now, I wouldn't release them into the wild. I wouldn't I wouldn't let them breed with other fishes. I mean, in a very controlled environment, I'd have no problem with this. That doesn't mean I have no problem with all aspects of genetic engineering. In fact, some of the aspects trouble me greatly. But as far as the fish goes, it was just a fish.
Actually, that's actually what we're going to get into later on in the interview about some of the possibly more negative or dangerous aspects of genetic engineering. Now, back in 2011, Creation Ministries International held a Creation Super Conference. On the second day, you gave a lecture called Genetics According to Jesus. Genetics Supports Biblical History. You also recently gave a new talk entitled Ancient DNA and the Bible. How does the study of genetics confirm what is recorded in the Word of God?
Honestly, all the geneticists that I know that are creationists, biblical creationists, young earth creationists, whatever you want to call them, we are all super excited about our field. And we're glad we're in genetics and not something like geology because our answers are so much easier to develop. And we've got, home run sorts of questions that we can throw at the evolutionary community and we don't think they can answer. The technology in a cell, the complexity of the genome, the fragility of DNA, the hypermutability of DNA. These are all things that are screaming design and are screaming youth at the same time. So, which direction you want to go? There's 10,000 cans of worms we can open up. Which one do you want to open up first?
Every single one of them.
All right, we'll pick one.
How about you said that they're all indicators of youth? Because if you look at the evolutionary time scale, we've got billions of years, but then in the biblical time scale, there's only thousands. And so how are those different things you mentioned indicators of youth?
Well, one of the indicators is when we look at genetic data, we see mutations popping up in different organisms or different people over time. Well, if you just look at the natural rate of mutation, you say, well, how long would it take to account for this much diversity? Well, only a few thousand years. That's the answer. And we've seen that in fruit flies and nematodes and humans and monkeys and all sorts of other species. When you just look at the mutation load, the diversity within a population, it's really easy to explain that in a short time frame. In fact, if millions of years was true, there'd be a lot more diversity than we see. Now, of course, the evolutionary community has a way to answer that. For humans, they say, "Oh, we went through a bottleneck in Africa, maybe 10 to 100,000 years ago, and because of that bottleneck, our population shrank down to a very small population, and we lost a lot of genetic diversity." Because when you have a small population with lots of inbreeding, there's you can't maintain a lot of diversity, and it just gets lost randomly. And that's when Homo sapiens evolved, and that's when after that, we left Africa and spread across the world. That's their answer to it, but the fact is there's not much genetic diversity within humans. And the fact is we can easily explain it in a biblical time frame. So it's like a direct prediction of the Bible, and it's right there in the data. And they didn't predict the data the way it is. They said, "Oh, no, now we're looking at this data. What do we do? Oh, let's come up with the out of Africa model to explain it."
So it was almost like, what would you call it, a post hoc hypothesis, where it was like tacked on to try and reinterpret the model because it doesn't anymore fit with the actual data.
That's right. Totally post hoc. There's also another example. I don't know what to call it in Latin, maybe non hoc. It's a thing where nobody could make a prediction before the experiment was run. And when the experiment was done, all the evolutionists said, "Ah, look at that! It's evolution is true." But wait a second. What prediction did you make, and how is it testable? And that is, how different are humans and chimpanzees? We are told, at least in the past, we're 99% identical. But the man who made that calculation, John Alquist, is now a young Earth creationist whom we've interviewed in Creation magazine. He was an evolutionist back in the 70s, and he did DNA hybridization studies where he was taking birds, and he was taking DNA of two different species of birds, putting them into was sort of like a test tube. It's called a cuvette. It's a square glass test tube. It's very clear. When you put it in a machine called a spectrophotometer, you can shine light through it at a certain wavelength, and DNA absorbs light at a certain wavelength very strongly when it's in this form. But when you warm it up and the DNA separates, it becomes very transparent at that wavelength. And so what he did was he was taking DNA of two different species, putting them into the same cuvette, warming it up, and then cooling it. And what would happen is the DNA would sometimes stick to the DNA of the other species. And you get this big bird's nest of DNA that would absorb a lot of light at that frequency. And then as you warm it up, all of a sudden the DNA would separate. And the more similar the two species were genetically, the tighter the DNA would bond to the other species' DNA, and a higher temperature would take before it separated. So he had a way of measuring dissimilarity and similarity. And well, he said with chimpanzee. And he mixed human and chimpanzee. And he got an answer like 99% similar. Years later, he realized the error. And that is, there are vast areas of the human chimpanzee genome that have nothing to do with one another. They're not at all similar. So they never match up in this experiment when you cool the DNA down. What you're doing is, as he was raising the temperature, he was waiting for the most similar parts of the genome to finally separate. And that's when he said, the light just changed. It's at that level. Yeah, there are some portions of the human genome and the chimp genome that are like 99% or more similar. This is true. But there are also vast areas that have no similarity at all. That's what evolutionary theory has to account for. Not how similar some parts are, but how similar all the parts are. When the human genome was sequenced, I think 2001, maybe 2003, draft versus the final one, I don't remember anymore. It's been nearly 20 years, 17 years at least. The next question that they wanted to ask was, all right, what about chimpanzee? I mean, the next obvious choice, in fact, even for me, the creationist, I want to know how similar chimpanzees are to human. So the next big sequencing program was a chimpanzee sequencing consortium program thing. I think that came out in 2005, but it was a debacle. It was completely spurious. There was nothing that good that ever came out of this. They said, aha, humans and chimpanzees are 99% identical. Really? Because they didn't actually sequence the chimpanzee genome. In order to sequence a genome, back then, the sequencing machines would make about 300 letter pieces. And you'd sequence all these pieces from all over the genome, but then you'd have to assemble the genome. You do that by taking pieces that overlap. If you get enough pieces that overlap, you can build your genome. And it takes a lot of sequencing. In fact, you probably had to sequence a genome probably 30-fold. Boom, boom. Because every once in a while, you get the same piece you get two of the same pieces. Well, let me say this. If you only sequence 3 billion letters, you'd be missing a lot of the genome because some of those little pieces would be overlapping and you'd have pieces missing. So you had to sequence it like 30 times over to fill in all the gaps. They didn't do that with chimpanzee. They sequenced it about 5 times over and took the pieces and lined them up on the human genome. They humanized it. Deliberately, they assumed common ancestry was true without ever actually testing it. And the result was a complete mess. The original human genome, we can't sequence, at least back then, we couldn't sequence centromeres and middle of chromosomes and the telomeres at the end of the chromosomes. And some of the highly repetitive segments in the middle of chromosomes, we couldn't sequence back then. And so we left them blank. Basically, we put like the letter N. Instead of ACGT, it would be N. And it'd be 10,000 N's in a row or 100,000 N's in a row. They're estimating the size of this place, and they just put a letter N in there. There were about 300 of those in the first human genome. When they sequenced the chimpanzee genome, there were 300,000 of those. A very strong indication that they had big problems in taking these chimpanzee pieces and lining them up on the human genome, and they had to bin them aside, unalignable. Well, what's all that? That's all the places where the human chimpanzee genome differ, but they couldn't align it, so they just put it in this extra bin. And literally, it was 10 years before we had another chimpanzee genome. In the meantime, someone had studied there's Yerkes facility here in Atlanta. They've got several generations of chimpanzees, and they actually sequence the genomes of grand chimps, parent chimps, and chimps. So 3 generations of chimpanzees in the same family. They sequence their genomes, and then they compared them to the original chimpanzee genome, and then they did it what's called de novo, from scratch. They said, okay, forget that. We're gonna assemble these genomes from scratch, not using the old version because that wasn't really a very good version. And they came up with a brand new way to do the chimpanzee genome. And what they reported, though, was the intersection of those two things. In other words, the places where the original chimpanzee genome agreed with the new chimpanzee genome, that's what they reported. And the places they differed, they just skipped over that. So even though they got 11 new chimpanzee genomes, we still didn't have a genome. It wasn't until recently we finally got a real one. And now that we take, a real from scratch de novo built high quality chimpanzee genome, if you take a random piece out of that and look for that random piece in the human genome, or you take a random piece in the human genome and look for that in the chimpanzee genome, you're going to find about 85% similarity, not 99%. That's a huge problem. The deal is this. I don't care how similar the human chimpanzee genomes are. I want to know, but the number doesn't matter to me. But what I do know is that the evolutionary community can't explain that much difference in only 6 million years. Because evolution is not measured in years, it's measured in generations. And out in the wild, the average chimpanzee generation time is like 27 years on average. Modern humans, our average generation time is about 30 years. Well, just using the number 30, if they claim 6 million to 6.5 million years, that's 6 million years. If you divide that by 30, that's only 200,000 generations. They can't do it mathematically. They can't explain millions upon millions of base pair differences that had to appear in one human or in one chimp and then spread out to all humans or all chimps so that all people today and all chimpanzees today have this difference that would take such a phenomenally long time, they don't have it. So some people have suggested a couple years ago that they've been tamped down strongly that maybe humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor like 13 million years ago, not 6 million years ago. Well, that's interesting. That would help explain their time problem, but that would also push apes into the time of the dinosaurs. And the evolutionists don't want to do that. So they put themselves in a box. They've only got this many millions of years to explain this many differences, and they're kind of stuck. And it's kind of funny. Now, I don't have this problem. Honestly, there's another point I want to make about the chimpanzee genome. If I look at chimpanzees and humans and rutabagas and humans, which one do you think would be more genetically similar to us? A rutabaga or a chimp?
Probably the chimpanzee.
Yeah, because they look like us, they act like us, they eat the same foods as us, they have the same temperature requirements as us, except we invented clothes and indoor heating. So we have the ability to leave the rainforest because we're smart. But because they're so much like us in so many ways, in fact, they're more similar to us than any other species, I would expect them to be genetically similar to us and more genetically similar than any other species. This is like a non-surprise. Now, how different? I don't know. And neither did the evolutionists. And so I'm perfectly happy with whatever the answer is. And the answer turns out to be even more happily impossible to explain in evolutionary time. So they look like two different creations. Now, I've studied human mitochondrial genome extensively. In fact, on my laptop, I've got about 53,000 human mitochondria in one folder. And I've done lots of analyses on these. I've looked at the human Y chromosome extensively. And I tell you what, I can align by eye, if I want to, any human mitochondrial genome, even Neanderthal, even the Denisovans. So some of these ancient DNAs from ancient peoples are clearly human. I cannot do it by eye with a chimpanzee. It's so different. I'm sitting there going, what is this? How does this even line up? And what parts where? Now, you can use a computer to do it, but then the computer is just saying this is the best alignment. It doesn't mean it's the real alignment. And my point is that they're so vastly different that it's clear from the human mind, because we're very good at pattern recognition, that humans and chimpanzees are a different creation. And even given evolutionary time, they don't have enough time to explain the differences. And in creation time, when we look at the diversity within the respective species, it's very easy to explain this much diversity in humans in a few thousand years, and this much diversity in chimpanzees in a few thousand years. And it keeps on going. There's so many other things. But let you ask another question here, so we do more of a discussion here. It's not the Rob show. I don't want to talk like forever. What else can you throw at me?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You actually mentioned that before I move on to another question, we can stay on this one. You mentioned that DNA, you called it fragile. You said that there's something about it that its fragility shows that it was designed. How so?
DNA is probably the worst possible chemical for any origin of life scenario that you can possibly imagine. We don't get nucleotides forming in random chemistry. We don't get polynucleotides forming in random chemistry. Like one of the big problems, even if you put nucleotides into some warm little pond, as Darwin said, they're not going to string together into long molecules because water breaks the bonds faster than the bonds can form. So if you filled up a pond with a high concentration of nucleotides and let it sit for 1,000,000 years, and then sucked all the water out and looked at all the nucleotides to see how long strings they would have formed, you'll get some that where there are two nucleotides stuck together. You get some maybe with 3, but you'll probably find none with 4, and you won't find any with 100, let alone millions. So the polymerization problem is massive. But also, DNA is really fragile, as in it is subject to oxidation. Oxygen destroys it. Water destroys it. The strands break. So we have chemical oxidation happening to the molecule, and the strand is fragile and breaks all the time. Within your cells, every single cell, they estimate there's about 1,000,000 DNA lesions per cell per day. That's oxidation and breaking. I mean, this is not a system that's maintainable without a maintenance system. So you can't start with DNA because it would break down so quickly, incipient life would never use it. In order to maintain DNA in our cells, we need very intricate and exquisite repair mechanisms. And there are different repair mechanisms for different types of problems, like single strand breaks, double strand breaks, deamination of cytosine and adenine. Um, there's all sorts of every single different possible change has its own repair system. The repair systems are complex in themselves. Even worse, the repair systems are proteins and RNAs that are coded in the DNA. So we have a chicken and egg problem first. What came first? The DNA or the ability to maintain the DNA, which is coded in the DNA? I mean, these are I always stumble on this one.
Intractable.
Intractable problems for the evolutionary story. But without an origin of life scenario that works, why are we even talking about evolution? Everything in chemistry is telling us that evolution is not going to happen. The probability of formation, the chemistry of formation, there's nothing in vast areas of science that suggests that the origin of life is even possible. And so I'm perfectly comfortable saying, no, it didn't happen, and life was actually created. And the coolest thing is that, back in the day, everyone thought life was really simple. I mean, Darwin thought that that the cell was just a bag of salt. And so if the cell made a square or turned purple or grew a spike, I'm like, yeah, I can imagine anything happening at all if I don't know what's happening on the inside. And the more simple life is, the more possible evolution might be. But life is utterly complicated. And the more complex our understanding of life is, the more we realize that evolution is impossible. And so, someone growing up, even up into the 50s, they could probably get away with thinking that, evolution was a simple thing. But that's not true today. The technological revolution that we've been witnessing over the last couple of decades has only told us that life is extremely fragile and extremely complex and impossible to explain in a millions of years evolutionary scenario that has no guiding hand. It requires a God who's better than life, more complicated than life, smarter than life, to infuse into life the complexity and the information required to maintain that complexity so that life can sustain itself over time.
So it sounds like the naturalistic point of view does not have the evidence required to sustain it, but then a design viewpoint seems to make more sense in light of the evidence that we see. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. The naturalistic view came to us from Darwin in the 1800s. I mean, what did Darwin know? There was people back then who were certain that you could read bumps on people's heads and tell their personality.
Phrenology, yeah.
And one of his contemporaries was Freud, who is a fraud. His psychology has just been debunked. This is ridiculous. Another contemporary was Karl Marx, father of communism. Every time that's been applied, it's been a dismal failure. We know that is a false economic system because it denies human nature. Well, Darwin was in that milieu, that mix of ideas, and he comes up with this very vague hypothesis about where all life came from. And, back then, he could get away with it. He couldn't get away with it today.
And so actually, I want to move on to the next question because now you started talking about the scientific milieu or the scientific atmosphere that Darwin grew up in. Now, Dr. Carter, when you spoke at the Faith Bible College International, you gave a talk called The Real Issue. And now you made a striking statement about science. You said, science is an act of worship when put in its proper context. What does science have to do with worship?
Oh, man. The Old Testament, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the glory of kings to reveal a matter. You've heard that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the ability to reveal things is no longer in the purview of just kings, who are scholars, some of them at least Solomon was, of the day, but in the realm of science. And as a scientist, I get to explore God's creation. And there have been times in my life where I have worked like a dog for months to generate some data. And then I draw a graph. And I'm looking at my screen, I'm looking at this graph, and I'm saying, this is amazing. No one in the world has ever seen this before. But God allowed me to see it. He revealed it to me, little old me. And it's humbling and it's worshipful because I get to say, God did that. This is something that God built, something that God made. And all of a sudden, now humans can understand it. It is literally a worshipful experience. Science is something that should cause us to fall on our knees and raise our hands and proclaim glory to the creator of the universe. And most scientists are completely missing the biggest joy of science. And it makes me sad to think that they don't even see what they're doing.
That actually really touched my heart. Now, to the next question, it's actually right in line with this last one. You, and it's Lita Kosner, you wrote a 3-part article series called Dystopian Science. The first article.
Ever.
I know, I love that article series. The first one was called.
For the listener, Lita and I were sitting there. We're just, talking. We talk a lot. We read a lot of articles together, and I love our co-authored articles. But this one was, what happens if we went through a nuclear war or a giant virus killed off most of the humanity, or if something happened where humanity went through a crash? Would we be able to rebuild science, and what would we need to know? And we answered it, yeah, we would rebuild science very quickly, especially if we had a biblical worldview. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So essentially the first article was called Why the Bible Enables Science to Work. So Dr. Carter, you already kind of summarized them. I was going to ask you, may you please summarize these articles and explain why having a biblical worldview is necessary for when you're studying science?
All right, let's imagine different worldviews. Let's go around the world and look at ancient cultures and look at the way they were thinking. Science does not work in Eastern religions. I mean, it can be sort of science, but not the way we have science today. And the reason for that is that Buddhism teaches that the world is an illusion. This world is not real. Well, that doesn't spark scientific thinking. It didn't work in like ancient Greece because the gods were fickle. What if the gods didn't like you as a scientist? What if Zeus threw down a lightning bolt, pow, and fried your lab rats when you're trying to study cancer? Oh, this thing killed the rats. No, Zeus killed the rats. How would you know? It doesn't work in animistic societies because you can't experiment on the universe. The universe might be experimenting back at you. But in a biblical world, we have a God who is the ultimate creator. And we have a God who's very complex. He's all-knowing, he's omniscient, and this God never does anything against his own nature. He's also not fickle like Zeus. The Bible says, the old King James, there's no shadow of turning with him. I love that phrase. Our God is a God of constancy and a God of law. And that ultimate lawgiver, if he created the universe, that universe should reflect some of his basic characteristics. And one of them is unchanging. 2 is full of law. So the God of the universe would have created a universe that operates according to law. That thought, that theological proposition that came from Christian philosophy is what sparked the scientific revolution of the 16 and 1700s. Now, there's a background behind it, a long chain of thinking and development. Was really the Protestant Reformation where science exploded because people were thinking that the universe should operate like a clock and the universe should have laws to it. And they went out and discovered those laws. In fact, if you ever struggled in science class, you remember all those horrible formulas. Oh man, you got to memorize another formula. Well, when you look at those formulas, they had some Greek letters in there and some things like that. But when you see an alphabet letter, that's usually the initials of a Christian's name. Because people who had a biblical worldview are the ones who laid down the foundations of modern science. It is an indisputable historical fact.
Actually, I'd like to ask you, this isn't one of the questions that I have, but I want to ask you, Who are some of your favorite founders of science? Those who were Christian, those who got the whole ball rolling. Who are some of your favorites?
I'm gonna say, well, my probably all-time favorite is Isaac Newton. Probably, I mean, I believe he's the greatest scientist that ever lived, but he did most of his brilliant science in his 20s. And the rest of his life, he wrote more about theology than he did about science. But he was just such an incredible thinker, and he gave us, the laws of motion. He gave us the law of gravity. And when you take the laws of motion and laws of gravity and you put them together, you've got the single greatest predictive engine in the history of man's thinking. That has led to more corollary hypotheses than anything else. I mean, we can explain how things orbit the sun, what's going to happen when we launch a satellite out into space. We can explain why, this happens, and that happens, and this happens, and that happens. We can explain why Mount Chimborazo in Ecuador is actually further from the center of the Earth than Mount Everest because of the way the Earth is spinning, and therefore the Earth bulges outwards. And Chimborazo is right near the equator, so it's on the outward bulge of the Earth, based on Newton. And it's just shocking and amazing. And he was a great man, and I'm actually awed by the things that he was able to do as a young man.
That's incredible.
Okay, my
Now,
other favorite scientist, though, is probably Johann Kepler, the great astronomer. He was caught up in the Protestant Catholic wars in Europe, and he had to flee from city to city. But his testimony is amazing, and he took the works of mainly Tycho Brahe. He took, sorry, he inherited the books of Tycho Brahe, who was doing lots and lots of solar observations, and he took that and he figured out that, oh, yeah, not only does the Earth go around the sun, but the orbits of the Earth and all the planets are not circular; they're ellipses. That's just a cool story. And then Newton explained using math and gravity theory why that's true. So before Newton, we said, oh, yeah, there were ellipses, but we didn't know why. And now Newton said, oh, it's because of gravity. That's just fun little anecdotes in science. And in fact, I guess my favorite scientists are not the geneticists. Interesting.
and so you said, I think you said Newton and then Kepler. That's amazing. Now, a lot of people will talk about there's plenty of evidence for creation, and there's an article on CMI's website called The Knockout Punch Syndrome. So essentially, the article's point is that creationists shouldn't be looking for some kind of winning blow of evidence that will convert somebody on the spot.
There's
However,
no magic. There's no magic bullet. It's
yeah.
not the way things work.
Mm-hmm. And so it's not like, somebody's going to instantly hear something and then instantly change their mind. But I wanted to ask you, how did you become a young earth creationist? And to you, what is the most convincing evidence that confirms young earth creation or biblical creation?
That question's got a lot of different aspects. Usually, a person who's wrestling with the subject takes time to process. Therefore, it's not a one thing that does it. Sometimes, though, you can find the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the person finally says, "Oh, okay, now I get it." But it's always preconditioned on other things that came before that. That's why there's no magic bullet. This is something we have to wrestle with ourselves, and something we have to really spend time with other people explaining. For me, the first question I had, because I believed in evolution growing up, and I was committed to evolution for a brief period of my life at least. When I learned that the famous walking whale fossil Pakicetus, the pictures I was seeing were actually just based on a few bones, a couple of teeth and bones in the skull, and they had the entire thing with paddle feet and everything. When I realized that that was just an artist's conception, I was like, wait a second. And then they found the rest of the skeleton. Oh, the thing has no transitional features at all. That happened when I was in my undergraduate at Georgia Tech, and that's the first thing that caused me to start saying, wait a minute, well, hold on a second. Someone was playing fast and loose with the data. What else might they be tweaking in their favor? And that started me on a lifelong quest to find things out for myself because I'm a skeptic. I don't necessarily believe anything someone tells me. I want to figure it out. I want to demonstrate it. I want to weigh how much can I trust that? Is there anything that argues against it? And so I do the scientific observation analysis of a lot of different fields. That was one of them. So fossil record was what started it. But then I got into genetics, and the genetic complexity, like I said earlier, is something that screams design and screams youth. So I'm kind of glad I'm in genetics because actually geology is a lot harder because there's just so much we don't know. But in genetics, have we have it today, and we have a lot of it, and it's amazing.
So now, you told us why you're a young earth creationist now, but I want to see your response to this next question. Why do you continue to be one? So here it is. John Green, American author and host of Crash Course, is an Episcopalian Christian and was listed in Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. In a video entitled October 22nd, the anniversary of Young Earth Creationism, he said that Young Earth Creationism and Young Earth Creationists are both idiotic and ludicrous. Dr. Robert Carter, why are you public about being a Young Earth Creationist in light of the fact that some people will choose to view you as idiotic or ludicrous?
Well, I don't think I'm idiotic, and I don't think my views are ludicrous, but I do think they significantly challenge some people, and that brings out more visceral reaction and harsher words actually than they're justified in using. Um, I one of the reasons why that I'm a public face in this is because for me, this was a very important topic in solidifying my faith in the Bible. I don't like having mutually opposing views at the same time. And I don't like saying, well, okay, the Bible really doesn't mean that, even though it seems to be saying that. And, well, I can just like ignore that. No, those things, they stick in the back of your mind and they rattle and rattle and they bug you and bug you and bug you until you say, stop, what is this? Can I actually answer that? And so I had to answer it. And so when I look at scripture from Genesis to Revelation, I see one contiguous whole, one long argument. And I see much of the New Testament is referencing the Old Testament, but specifically Genesis in a lot of very important ways. And if you just take Genesis out, if you make that mythological, you got some big problems explaining like salvation, the resurrection, the work of Jesus. If you get rid of the first Adam, you're probably getting rid of the last Adam. In fact, some secular atheists have said very similar things to what I just said there. This is a massive problem. If you can't explain where sin comes from, if you can't explain that God demanded that death is a punishment for sin, then you can't explain why Jesus is hanging on the cross. You can't explain why God demanded death of his son to pay for our sins. Well, it comes from the Garden of Eden. But in the evolutionary model, death has always been around. Death is what produces people from monkeys in the first place. But in the creation model, it's very clear death came after creation. And so there's a lot of theological implications of this. And it's not, honestly, it's not a science argument, it's a theology argument. Theology is critically important. We're talking about people either roasting in hell forever or being with Jesus in heaven forever on a recreated earth forever. That's a really important thing. And this science is just a platform to help me preach the gospel as best I can. Because I know that I have been saved and I want other people to find it also. But evolution is a massive stumbling block to a lot of people. Now, I know there's a lot of Christians that are perfectly happy with having the earth being millions of years old and having evolution being true, and they still believe in Jesus, and they still believe in the resurrection, and they still believe in heaven. But I also know a lot of people who are not willing to have those two opposing views in their mind at the same time, and the one that usually loses is Christianity. And so it's important to me personally, but it's also important to me in a kingdom sense. And I just want to be used by God to further his kingdom in any way he can. If he wants to use a nerd like me with horrible social skills and terrible grammar, I mean, okay, let's do it, God. Use me if you can. And for some strange reason, he's put me at Creation Ministries International. he's turned me into an author. I mean, are you kidding me? I got out of Georgia Tech without being able to read or write. I mean, because I didn't take any English classes because I took one and I got a C. It's the only C I made at Georgia Tech, and I was really mad. And so I have avoided grammar and English like since I was a kid. And now I'm an author. And I've got a lot of articles on creation.com. What? And I actually put the commas and the periods I've even used a semicolon in a couple of times. Woohoo. Anyway, what I'm saying is I have a certain skill set and a certain anti-skill set. And somehow God has taken me with this skill set and has been able to use me in a way that I'm happy to be used. If I was, a street sweeper, I would hope that I would be singing praises to God while I was sweeping the streets. If I was a cafeteria worker, in fact, I ran into a cafeteria worker at a hospital a couple years ago, and she was just singing hymns and da 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 da. And she was checking me out, and, end up my food and typing in the cash register, and I paid her, and I just thanked her for singing. It was just a wonderful thing to see a Christian just gushing all about God out in public. And so, if God can use me in this way, glory to God. I want to be used in this way.
Now, you mentioned that there are some people and they like to hold some of these different views. Now, that's my next question. Young Earth Creationism is sometimes referred to as biblical creationism. However, as seen from the last question, not all who profess to be believers in Christ are also young earth creationists. There are also some Christians who subscribe to the old earth creationist view, the theistic evolutionist view, intelligent design, or other origins models. Are those ideas biblical? And if not, where do those concepts fall short?
I don't want to say outwardly that a fellow Christian holds an unbiblical view, because I understand there's a range of interpretations on some passages, and I understand also that I used to be in the other camp. I've tried all the other flavors of trying to add long periods of time to Scripture, day age theory, gap theory, theistic evolution. I've tried them all. So I understand why people are wrestling with this, and I understand where they're coming from when they're holding a different viewpoint than mine. And I don't want to just throw them under the bus. However, after years of studying this, I don't see how the Bible doesn't say that the earth is young and God created the universe thousands of years ago. It's so clear. In fact, if words have meaning, and if the writers of Genesis want to intend for us to understand Genesis, and they meant something different, well, then they must have been lying, because it's clear what they meant. And later on in the scripture, when they refer to that, it's clear that everyone in the Bible thought the earth was not millions of years old and that humans did not evolve from monkeys, that we actually had a separate creation from scratch, and the death entered the world after that. And we find it in so many different places in the Bible. So, on the one hand, I understand the other viewpoints. On the other hand, let's just say it this way: I was never satisfied with those other viewpoints because I knew the contradictions. Intellectually, they never worked for me. Now, if someone's listening and they have one of those other viewpoints, okay, keep thinking, keep wrestling. It's always worth struggling with the Word of God. It's always worth fighting to figure out if these words really mean this, or maybe they mean something else, because all that does is bring us closer to God and deeper into the Scripture and give us a better understanding of things. The reason that people wrestle with this is because of the concept of millions of years that comes to us from a philosophy called naturalism. Naturalistic philosophy came into the world pretty much in the 1700s, early 1700s, during a time of that they call the Enlightenment, when these scholars are like, oh yes, we are enlightened. Everything before us, that was the Dark Ages. Well, that's nonsense. But besides that, this millions of years concept derives directly from the thought that the only thing we can use to explain the universe are natural processes. And you know what? Nature usually operates pretty slowly. So if you want to explain a mountain range, well, let's go down to a river. Oh, the river just overflowed its banks. Oh, it left a little sandbar behind. Okay, well, take that little sandbar and now look at the Alps. How many river overflowings would have caused to actually form the Alps? Oh, that would have taken millions of years. So this idea of naturalism is what leads into the idea of millions of years. And evolution actually came 100 years afterwards. Charles Darwin couched all of his ideas of the evolution of living things on the concept that the earth was millions of years old, which came from a concept 100 years before that called naturalism. So Christians who are really struggling with the age of the earth and evolution and things like that, you got to dig deeper. You got to go behind the scenes and realize that naturalism is the problem. The Bible teaches theism. The Bible teaches creationism. The Bible teaches that God created the universe by fiat. Boom, here's a universe. Not that the universe evolved very slowly over long periods of time using the laws of physics and chemistry and geology and things like that that were discovered just a few centuries ago.
Now, you actually brought up a diversity of views and philosophies, and that brings us to our next question. Dr. Carter, in your article called How to Think, Not What to Think, you wrote, "And because our God is a God of logic and order, it is not a stretch to conclude that the ultimate lawgiver would have created a universe that operates according to logic and laws. This is the reason why we can embrace science and the Bible at the same time and without contradiction. And this is why we reject things like conspiracy theory, alt science, and deep time naturalistic evolutionary theory." End quote. Now, how do Christians avoid falling into false ideas or succumbing to cult-like conspiracy brainwashing?
That's a tough one because I'll use the flat earth movement of recent years as an example. Essentially, there were no flat earthers 10 years ago. YouTube invented basically an internet cult and with lots of brainwashing, etc. And I hope I did make some of you mad, but this is true. The earth is not flat. They are using some of the same arguments that the Young Earth Creationists use. And they're using some of the same thinking patterns that the Young Earth Creationists use. And that's makes us sad and scary at the same time. But they go too far. We have for years said that the difference is between operational science and historical science. Operational science is the things we can know today, right now, the things we can directly observe and test today. We can observe, test, and repeat experiments, draw hypotheses, test our hypotheses. That type of science has led to the development of all of our modern technologies. On the other hand, there's this thing called historical science. That's when you reach back into the past and try to explain something that you weren't there to see. And so the creation evolution debate, we're not arguing over the boiling point of water, the force of gravity. We're arguing over, did some stumpy-legged fish crawl out of an ocean 500 million years ago? How old is the universe? Are Neanderthals human or not? Those are historical questions. That's where the creation evolution debate lies. So things that are obvious, things that we can test, things that we can put hypotheses together and build into a cohesive whole are not things that we're debating. So there's no reason to debate the shape of the earth. It is absolutely 100% abundantly clear the earth is round. We also know that the earth goes around the sun. This is clear from physics. Yeah, mathematically, you can put the sun at the center, or the earth at the center, or the moon at the center, or the tip of my nose at the center. Mathematically, you can do whatever you want. But according to physics, the earth goes around the sun, and the sun moves through the heavens because it's not tethered to anything. So we have to be able to divide science into what we can know and what we only think we know. And when we look at what we only think we know, we realize a lot of what we think is actually things that are couched in philosophy. And once that philosophy is understood, science changes. I have a very, very concrete view of science. I have a very concrete view of gravity and light and time and all sorts of things like that. But that's only because I believe that my God is upholding the universe in a constant manner. Because he created, he infused it with his wisdom and his power, and he's actually holding it. But one day the heavens are going to be rolled up like a scroll. That's not naturalistic. And one day God's going to recreate the heavens and the earth. That's not naturalistic. But right now, the universe is trustable because God and his providence is upholding it in a trustable manner. I think that's really good science. And then in another article that I wrote called "We Are Less Than Dust," as one of my favorite things I've ever written, I talked about the nature of reality, and I explained to the audiences what matter is made of. And all I did was, well, one of the things I did is I said, let's look at matter. Let's look at two nuclei in a molecule that might be in my head. Let's make the nucleus as large as the sun. Okay, now in that molecule, where's the next nucleus? It's actually 13 times further away than Pluto is from the sun. And since electrons essentially have no space, they don't take up any volume. Sorry, I should say it that way. The space between two different sun-sized nuclei is completely empty. So our bodies are made of 99.9999 something percent empty space. All of a sudden, our existence becomes very strange. And when we understand that we don't know what light is, we don't know what gravity is, we don't know what electromagnetism is, we don't know what makes up subatomic particles, the most important things in the world, we have no clue what they actually are. And then when we realize that what you're seeing on screen here, all you're seeing is photons reflecting off of an electronic force field. And inside that electronic force field is almost nothing. A few nuclei spaced apart in vast distances. What is reality even? I mean, all of a sudden things are getting very strange. And yet getting there makes you realize that everything is tenuous. And yet I'm not afraid of this because I trust the God of the Bible, who has promised that seasons will not change. There'll be summer and there'll be winter and harvest time. He promised that things are going to continue to go along, and we don't have to say, oh, all of a sudden the force of gravity is going to change. We're going to fly off into space and we're all going to suffocate. It's never going to happen because our God promised it wasn't going to happen. Not that specific promise, but in general. Therefore, I trust the world. I trust what I'm seeing. I trust reality. But I also know that one day God's going to take reality and go, and then we're going to see that we're really made of nothing.
That's absolutely amazing. It's stunning to think because normally human beings, we have a tendency to think very highly of ourselves and we tend to like to pat ourselves on the back. But from what you're saying, we're basically nothing. The only thing that gives us value is that God loves us.
Yeah. Well, that brings up another interesting discussion on human worth, the value of a human being or human life in the evolutionary model. If you actually dig down and apply strict Darwinian evolutionary naturalistic principles, human beings have no worth. Because if naturalism is true, there's no need for a God at any step of the way. Even the Big Bang can be explained naturalistically, even though it doesn't really work mathematically, but fine. They say they can explain everything naturalistically. That means there's no need for a God. That means there's no human soul. That means there's no meaning to life. That means that you're actually worth nothing. This is one reason why someone like Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union, long time, he could sleep well every night, even though he knew he just signed a warrant that's going to lead to the death of 10,000. Because to him, that was no different than cutting the grass. Because the human being, the body is just minerals. It's just molecules that you could, I mean, literally throw a person in the furnace, take their ashes, and use it for fertilizer. There's no net worth of those ashes being constituted into a human form. The old adage, the old argument, philosophical argument: are we just a machine, or is there a ghost in the machine? Well, to most evolutionists, there's no spirit. We're just a machine. Machines have a function maybe for planting crops or reproduction, but there's no inherent worth or value to a machine. They're just parts. And if it breaks, whatever, you fix it or you get a new one.
So it's almost like, in one hand, in the biblical worldview, we're the children of God, but if the evolutionary worldview is true, what you're saying is like we're mere machines that, once they break down, they can essentially be dispensed with, if you take it to that logical line of thinking.
And this illogical line of thinking that is clearly illustrated in a lot of writings of evolutionary philosophers and evolutionary scientists. We know it's there, just most people don't like to talk about it openly because nihilism is a very uncomfortable philosophical position. That's exactly where this goes. In fact, Charles Darwin himself got there. In his autobiography, it is clear that if you don't have Christianity, you've got no reason for anything. He knew it. Evolutionists today know it. Some Christians know it, most don't. And so what they're doing is, most Christians, and I used to do this too, so I'm not casting stones, they're actually trying to weld two philosophies that are mutually contradictory. And if you drive something to the extreme and you realize that that's ridiculous, that means your starting position was bad too. And nobody wants to be told that they're worthless, because we all inherently know that we have a value. And honestly, our value might not be in the eyes of other people. Our value is in the eyes of our Creator. And so again, the gospel comes in here. We can take these arguments and say, no, let's talk about the Bible here. Let's talk about the God of the Bible, who created you and loves you and wants you to live with him. Come on, let's not go down this nihilistic route and go just jump off a bridge because there's no meaning to life. There's a very important meaning to life, and there's a very important purpose to life. We are here to glorify God. That's why he created us. So let's do it.
I like how you ended. We are here to glorify God. That's why we exist. That's our purpose. That's our meaning. Now, I quoted you in the last question, because now I'm going to move on to this next one. You mentioned that CMI rejects things and you reject things like conspiracy theory, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there does seem to be a suppression of the young earth or biblical creationist viewpoint at the academic level. According to Stephen D. Smith, who holds the United Nations Chair on Genocide Education, and you actually just spoke about genocide in the last answer, he says, a disturbing feature of the debate, and he's not a creationist, by the way, he says a disturbing feature of the debate over evolution is the aggressive campaign by many in the scientific and judicial establishments to silence the opposition so that only the Darwinist story will be heard. Are young earth creationists being censored, Dr. Robert Carter, and what can be done about that?
Back in the 1800s, a very famous political commentator of the day, he was actually part nobility, uh, the Duke of Argyll. I don't remember his real name, but it's the Duke of Argyll. He wrote a very important essay. And in this essay, he wrote about a reign of terror at the hands of the early Darwinists, as they were mocking, excluding, cutting people off, and making sure that only their people got into positions of power. And he wrote about how political it was and how determined they were and how successful they were. And that's been true ever since, because you see, because of human nature, if Christianity was a dominant viewpoint in our world today, and it's not, if creationism was a dominant viewpoint within the sciences, I know how humans behave. We tend to be bigoted. We tend to be short-sighted. We tend to be herd pack animals. We tend to, benefit our friends and anti-benefit our opponents. And this is the way humans are. So if Christianity was ruling the day, I'm pretty certain that it would be really hard to get a bully pulpit if you're an atheist. And yet, the reverse is true today. Christians are being marginalized, excluded. The creationist viewpoint is just mocked. And usually it's mocked when they say, that's not science. But they just changed the definition of the word. What they meant was, that's not naturalism. And that's true. It's not naturalism, because naturalism is fallacious. It doesn't work. Therefore, there must be something else. There must be some sort of a creator, whether he's a long-term creator or a short-term creator, or we can let the Christians figure that out and argue amongst ourselves. But, as Lewontin said, you can't allow a divine foot in the door. Because as soon as you back away from naturalism, anything could be true, including a council of gods. The Greek gods might be the creators. The Babylonian gods might be the creators. The Norse gods could be the creators, or there could be some alien race that just created this universe. I mean, literally a super complex, powerful alien race that created the whole universe and put us here. Or the God of the Bible could be true. And so, because they don't allow anti-naturalistic viewpoints, they do everything they can to marginalize the non-naturalists. And I am definitely not a naturalist. I am a theist. I believe in God. I believe in an active God who has had a creative and pervasive role in this universe and is still doing that. He's still maintaining his role in the universe. This is not naturalistic. Well, actually, that's not even true. It's not true. It's not naturalism, but it is naturalistic. I believe that this universe operates naturalistically. There are laws to the universe because our God created those laws and created the universe to comport with those laws. Naturalism, in the end, is a wonderful science for the laboratory. I mean, it's not like we think that the little pixies in the garden that run into the laboratory at night and rearrange the test tubes in order to drive some scientific result in an experiment. No, it's naturalistic. Things operate according to the laws of probability and the laws of chemistry and things like that. So even if naturalism is a great science for the laboratory, it's a lousy science for origins. And Darwin thought it was a great science for origins. And now 150 years later, we're realizing how wrong he was.
Indeed, and you mentioned how on a normal basis we don't have things like pixies or leprechauns or any other such mythical creature running around and essentially changing or tweaking what's going on in like a test tube. Now, some atheists make the accusation, well, the occasional miracle, say in the Bible, like Jesus multiplying bread, is that any way upending science? Can those two things harmonize, science and miracles?
No, miracles are associated with the divine. They're associated with the non-normal. They're associated with things that are trying to make a point. God is making a point here. Jesus made the point. I created bread. Oh, I'm the creator. I can raise life. Why? Because I created life. In fact, you know what? I'm going to raise myself from the dead because you can't kill God. I am life. And so miracles associated with Jesus, miracles associated with the apostles, these are one-off events. Miracles are not common. Someone said, if you take all the miracles in the Old Testament, it's like one miracle every century. It's something like that. They're not common. Lots of miracles happen in Elijah's day and Elisha's day. Okay. But then there are vast periods of time when there are no miracles. In fact, you get to Jesus and all of a sudden he heals a leper. No leper had ever been healed in Israelite history. This whole passage is Leviticus that were never enacted because, the priest never had to say, oh, you've been healed of leprosy. Let's go through this passage here to see what happens. How to test if it's really happened, how to make sure you're clean. There's entire chapters. No one had ever used them before. The only leper that I'm aware of that was healed was Naaman, the Syrian. It was an Israelite. He didn't have to go through. So Jesus heals a leper. Oh, you know what he did? He just said, I'm the Messiah. And then he heals 10 lepers. He says, I'm really the Messiah. And he's raising people from the dead. This is not science. What Jesus is saying is that naturalism isn't true. But we don't believe in miracles in a laboratory because it's not the way God generally operates. His normative operation is to be constant. He does break his own rules occasionally because he can, because he has the authority to do so. And when he does so, he's doing it to illustrate a very important point. And you know what? The rate of E. coli growing in a dish is not an important point, but someone raising from the dead is. So I have no problems with miracles, and I don't think miracles are happening in my laboratory. In fact, this is something going back to the dawn of science. If miracles were a problem for science, then we would not have modern science, because the early modern scientists almost universally believed in the Bible and believed in miracles, and yet they still pursued science and they still discovered all the scientific laws and theories that we have today. And that list is very long.
And we had spoken about some of those people earlier. You had mentioned Newton and Kepler. And now this actually ties in to our next question. This is a quote from Stanley Jackie. This is a physicist and a philosopher of science. They said that the principles that undergird science, quote, came to us in their full force through the Judeo-Christian belief in an omnipotent God, creator and sustainer of all things. Your friend, Dr. John Sanford, even has a talk entitled How Evolution Hurts Science. So, Dr. Carter, how does the evolutionary theory hurt science? How does the creation theory propel science? And if the evolutionary theory hurts science, why is it still being propagated? There are 3 questions, and so you can address them 1, 2, 3.
Okay, you're gonna have to ask me them again,
Sure.
because I want to step back a step. There's also an excellent article on creation.com called "The Christian Roots of Science." Very important idea and very, very interesting. In fact, that's where I first got introduced to these things, reading that article. I think it was written by Jonathan Sarfati, my dear friend and office mate. Okay, now, what's the first question?
The first question is, how does the evolutionary theory hurt science?
If naturalism is not true, by strictly appealing to naturalism, we're going to miss a lot of important things. But also, there have been a lot of examples in evolutionary science where actually what they were doing was hurting people. I had my tonsils operated on about 20 years ago, so I had a lot of throat infections. But he didn't take my tonsils out because they don't like to do that anymore, because the tonsils are very important parts of your immune system. In fact, out of the tonsils come lots of things that help keep infections out of our throats and lungs. Oh, so they're important. The appendix. The appendix was once called the vestigial organ also, but now we know so many different functions to the appendix, we don't know what the primary function is. People were having all these odd back treatments when they're trying to straighten out the back because they had back pain. Let's straighten it out because this curvature is part of our evolutionary heritage. Blah blah blah. Well, no, actually, the curvature is a structurally important factor that allows us to stand up straight and tall. In fact, the physics of it is you want to curve in your back, and yet there are well-respected scientists today, but today I just think they're just quacks. They're getting people to try to straighten out the curve in their back to fix back pain. All it did was make it worse. There are a lot of examples of how evolutionary science has slowed down the march of science. We've listed them on creation.com. There's examples out there. They're so numerous, it's even hard to know where to start.
And then my second question was, the evolutionary theory has been shown to hinder science. And so you mentioned people are ending up trying to heal their back pain, but because of a mistaken evolutionary belief, they're hurting it. Now, if that's what the evolutionary theory does, it has bad fruits for science. On the flip side, does the Young Earth creation model do anything good for science? Does it propel science? Are there any good ideas, good fruit that comes out of the Young Earth creation model?
Yeah, tons of it. Because we think the universe is designed, we naturally gravitate toward design and engineering. And one of the huge new things that's coming out of science today is called biomimetics. Mimetics. That's where you take a design in nature and say, oh, let's re engineer that and make the new thing. It could be either a new medicine, it could be a new technology. I mean, one of the classic examples is Velcro. A scientist noted a cockleburr stuck on his clothing, and he said, "Oh, the little hooks and little barbs." Boom! He invented Velcro. That's called biomimetics, and we're seeing that. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of examples over the last couple of years of people looking at nature and re-engineering and applying it into our modern world. That's a design idea. Yeah, evolutionists can do that too, but part of the reason why this is becoming popular is because the creationists have been talking about design and functionality in.
That's pretty interesting. So, on one hand, we have the evolutionary theory. When it's applied to science, we end up getting a hindrance to progress. When we apply design ideas or creation ideas, science ends up propelling. Now, if that's the case, that the evolutionary theory will hinder science, but then the creation theory will propagate science, why is the evolutionary theory still being taught?
Because it's a spiritual battle. It's not about facts and figures and numbers. It's about philosophy. It's about existence. It's about the meaning to life. It's about, is there really a God in heaven? Honestly and truly, naturalism is the greatest excuse for man to be his own agent independent of God that anyone has ever invented. But it's just a philosophy. It doesn't mean it's true. It's an overriding principle that guides thought and research. And yet it's false because science says this can't be true, and yet people believe it because the alternative is simply not something anyone wants to think about unless you're a Christian. Because if there's a God in heaven, that's a very scary proposition. What if you don't know that God? Or what if you're not doing the things that God wants you to do? If he's your creator, he could also be your judge. And so people don't want to go there. I brought up earlier the chimpanzee genome. That's a classic example of how evolutionary science held back scientific progress because we did not have a chimpanzee genome for about 10 years after the first time the chimpanzee genome was sequenced. It just didn't exist because the original one was a pile of garbage. It took us a long time. And I think what happened was they told all the graduate students to not study the chimpanzee genome, and very, very few papers were published on it for like a decade. And after enough time had passed, they said, okay, we can now redo it. And no one's going to have egg on their face because we can say, oh, yeah, that was back then. We've learned a lot since then. And now we're going to correct some of the older errors. And probably some of the important people that were involved in it had retired. So they're not going to be contradicted while they're still in public. And so it was just a big media campaign damage exercise. But I'm glad we now have a real chimpanzee genome, and I wish we had it back in 2005, but we didn't.
We're going to move on to another question. You mentioned in your last answer, and this ties directly into what we're about to speak about, that God in heaven could be a judge. So now the evolutionary theory, besides negatively impacting science in the ways that you mentioned, it also raises some disturbing ethical questions. In 1871, Charles Darwin, in his book Descent of Man, wrote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races
Just throughout the world.
throughout the world," end quote. So Darwin, he then goes on to
The
lump.
many times in one of my talks that I've almost got it memorized. It's extremely disturbing. All right, go ahead. Keep going.
Well, that's okay. That was amazing. You have that quote in your mind memorized because when I first read that, I was taken aback because then he goes on to lump Australians, gorillas, and he uses a term for black people that I won't repeat into the category of savage. And so this question is going to have two parts. So first and foremost, what are the origins of the different races? And Dr. Carter, in your article called Racial Mixing is Perfectly Biblical, you and a colleague wrote a refutation of the belief that Adam is and was the father of the white race. So someone had written into CMI, they were propagating that view. So the second part of the question is, are there grounds for racist beliefs in the Bible, and are there grounds for racist beliefs in the evolutionary theory?
I have to handle this one very carefully because I don't want to accuse evolutionists of being racists, especially modern evolutionists, because the world's become much more sensitive to this topic and people are a lot more accepting of other people. But in evolutionary theory, there's a very strong strain of abject racism that was pretty much ended at World War II because of the horrors of the Holocaust. But I mean, what Darwin wrote there is 1871. He essentially said, "Man in a more civilized state," he meant Europeans. And then he said, "It's something as low as a baboon." He said, "The gap will exist later on this much instead of now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla." Now, I know you didn't want to use that word, but Darwin used it, so I'm just quoting Darwin. Anyway, and if that gap is greater, it means these things will be killed off, and then the gap is bigger. Well, he's putting Europeans in a higher pedestal, men in a more civilized state. He meant white people, than the brown people and the black people in the world. That's disgusting. That's just flat out wrong. But it's a natural product of evolutionary theory because you know what? If evolution is true, there are some groups that should be more advanced in some way than some other groups. Maybe they're more intelligent, maybe they're more moral, maybe they're stronger, maybe they're faster, maybe they're smarter. There should be differences between the groups. But it's not true. It is simply not true. No, Asians are not smarter than other people. They do work a lot harder because their culture pushes them that way. Jewish people are not smarter than other people. They just have a culture that breeds creative thinking. Africans are not dumber, or if I'm not saying it, Africans are not faster than Europeans. It's not true. Now, there is one particular group in Kenya that tends to be produce people who win the marathon, but it's a subset of a group. The Kenyans in the same tribe, similar genetically, and down the mountain, some other place, they're not producing people who are winning marathons. Why? Because their culture is producing people who tolerate pain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so even in the creation model, actually, we could produce a group of people who are taller, faster, something like that. That's really not that big a problem. But intelligence is notoriously difficult. You take someone from a culture and put them in another culture. Within a generation or two, they will be operating exactly with their peers because they're not dumb. They're poor. They're hungry. They're surviving stress and warfare and things like that. But get them but take the people in this other culture who maybe you think more advanced and put them in the culture that's struggling. And with a generation or two, they're going to be right alongside those other people because culture is the main driver of the differences we see amongst people groups and history and money and food. All right, so we still have to be able to explain how so-called races develop in the creation model, and it's actually really easy. All we have to do is have God put into Adam and Eve some genetic diversity. That diversity would be on the earth before the flood. That diversity would be on Noah's Ark. It would be on the earth after Noah's flood, before the time of the Tower of Babel. And at Babel, God divides the world up into little groups, and he separates them. And each of those little groups is not going to have all of the genetics of the Babel population. They're going to have a subset, and they're going to go over here, and this group's going to go over here, and this group's going to go over here. And if they're reproductively isolated from themselves for a while, they're going to start looking different over time. And so the races should naturally develop in a creation model because of isolation with distance. And we see that. In fact, modern geneticists, we cannot draw a line between white people and, sorry, I shouldn't say white because I'm not white. My hair is more whiter than my skin is. I'm not white. Anyway, we can't draw a line between Europeans and Asians, Asians and Australians, Europeans and Africans. There's no cutoff. It's not like all Africans have this, all Europeans have that. It's not true. In fact, there are zero differences where all Europeans have something and no one else in the world has it. Zero. Now, there are things that are in Africa very common. Sure, okay, fine. But they're also found in Europe, just rarely. So we're talking about not dramatic differences. We're talking about grades of differences. And when you go to places like the Middle East, you realize that those people had the genetics of Africans and Europeans and Asians because the world is a giant melting pot. And it's always been like that. And the reason that anyone on earth can marry and have children with anyone else on earth is because we are one species. We are recently separated from one another, and we're all created in the image of God. So we all have the intellectual, on average, the intellectual and moral capacity of everyone else in the world. We have an antidote to racism, and that we're all one in Adam. In fact, the reason my kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, could die for me, even though I'm not Jewish, he's called the last Adam. Well, I'm related to Jesus through the first Adam. So I'm cursed because the first Adam's sin. I've inherited that sin. Fine. But I'm blessed through the last Adam's obedience. And that obedience can be applied to me in the eyes of God. So there's a lot of theology here, and there's a lot of answers to this racism problem we're having, which was, honestly, it's not that Christianity is blameless or guiltless. It's not that Christian theologians have not made grave mistakes when trying to explain races over previous centuries. But if you do look at the Bible, we do have a very clear answer to it. And it's not like evolutionists are racists, but the early evolutionists definitely were. And it's a natural outworking of evolutionary theory. It's not a natural outworking of the Bible. And so, yeah, you can still be a racist and be a Christian, fine, but you're actually operating contrary to Scripture. You can be a racist and be an evolutionist, true, and you're probably operating according to evolutionary theory. Yuck. All right, I wonder how
Yeah,
many people
because
are going to be really mad.
that's okay, because I think I actually mentioned, because you had mentioned, the world's a giant melting pot. It's always been that way. Someone wrote into CMI, and I wanted you to address this specific comment here now. They wrote into, so this is not what CMI said. This is not what you said. Somebody wrote into CMI. They said Adam is and was the father of the white race. Is Adam the father of the white race? Is that true, biblically or scientifically?
Yes, Adam, though, is the father of all races. But when you say white race, what are you even talking about? Because, first of all, white is the wrong color. It means Europeans. But even strangely, okay, this is a really cool aspect. I'm going to change the subject here. You ask that question again in a minute, but this is a little rabbit trail. We have this new thing called ancient DNA. And ancient DNA is amazing and fun. And we're now able to pull DNA out of graves from people who died a long time ago. And when we started doing that, we started realizing that history is not what we thought. First of all, you look at ancient people living in Europe through multiple archaeological levels, the Bell Beaker people, the linear ceramic culture, Bronze Age people. You look at all these different levels of occupation in Europe, and there's no European DNA. The Europeans weren't in Europe. In fact, the variant that causes the light skin color, we know where it is. We know what its name. We know what the letter changes on the end of chromosome 16. In fact, the reason I have this skin color is because I have two identical copies of this variant, and so did my parents. So that's called inbreeding. But that variant, we know when it came into Europe. It's not in the earliest Europeans. And if you're looking around the world, say, okay, so where the Europeans were most of history, they're in Asia. They're north of the Caspian Sea, in the steppes, the Caspian steppe, the Pontic steppe. And so these are things out on the grasslands. They're called kurgans, these giant mounds of dirt covered in grass. Well, those are tombs. And if you dig into one of those, you might find a horse and a chariot and a chieftain and a sword. And, oh, look at this. We found this ancient warrior. But if you look at his DNA, he's European. And the Europeans didn't get to Europe until the Bronze Age. That's like the period of the judges in the Bible. King David's in the Iron Age. The Bronze Age is before that. That's not what I expected. So the Europeans aren't European, but the same is true for some Africans. The major African Y chromosome branch, the ones that found the Y chromosomes found in 95% of Africans. When you look at the tree, it splits off from non-Africans. And that group there splits off from non-Africans, and that group splits off from non-Africans. In fact, one of the last groups to split is Group C. Well, Genghis Khan was a C. He lived in Mongolia. So you have this massive group of Africans that obviously did not arise in Africa. They rose outside of Africa and then invaded and took over. Same thing happened in Europe with the European Y chromosomes. They're not there in the early archaeology. They're latecomers. In fact, it's some really, really crazy thing. I have a Y chromosome that is shared with 80% of other European men, of Western European men. It's called group R1b. Okay, fine. I'm a generic European male. But first of all, my Y chromosome group is young. It's all of our branches are short. We all go to a common ancestor, way after creation. So we're a younger group that arose and then took over a large portion of Europe. Okay. But there are other Y chromosomes in Europe from very different parts of the family tree. And so when we look at those, we realize that Europeans can be very different from one another as far as where they fall on the family tree. But there's a branch of my family tree, this R1b, that's found in Cameroon. That's like if you take Africa and you look at the dead center of Africa, Cameroon. We're talking about south of Sahara Desert, south of Lake Chad. And these men have the darkest skin of all people in the world. And yet they're my cousins. I could be more closely related on my father's side to some man from Central Africa with the darkest skin in the world than my great, great, great Irish grandfather's next door neighbor who could have been from a different part of the family tree. So, what is white? What's European? What's a race? We can't define these things anymore. And yet, in the biblical model, we have very good reasons for saying there are no races. We're all descended from Adam. We're all descended from Noah, and that was only like 4,500 years ago. It's only 150 to 200 generations of all of human history since the flood. So we're all kissing cousins, and that's what we're finding out genetically. Okay, now, that was a very long rabbit trail. Do you remember what your question was, or did I answer it?
You answered it, but you also led me to the next question. You mentioned so much history and so much science in the next question, you actually perfectly set up this next one. So, another ethical question that's raised as we look to the future of science. Now, actually, you've described yourself in your talks as a history geek, and you even said that you had to choose between studying science and history. You had them on both hands, you ended up going with science, but history now is currently being experimented on by science as we speak. So we've come a long way from Dolly the sheep in 1996. But what is the future of cloning, and how should Christians respond to the idea?
Okay, now you kind of blended two ideas together. One is my love of history and love of science, and the fact that I found and one major aspect of genetics is actually studying questions about history. So I found myself in the science of history, which I absolutely love. And that's what I just talked about for the last 10 minutes. But now you get into cloning. Ooh, this is really scary. Now, I have no problem with cloning a sheep. It's a sheep. I mean, the only reason sheep exist in their current form is because we have bred them for centuries and maintained them. And if we want to take a great sheep and clone it, fine. We've got a nice, healthy sheep. Now, I have a problem with breeding things like bulldogs because they're so inbred and they have so many different defects, genetic defects, that honestly, a breed like that either needs to be outbred and made stronger or just let it wither on the vine, because it's not fair to breed animals that hurt and that have problems. But as far as cloning goes, I mean, sheep is a sheep. It's a farm animal. We eat them. We use their skin, we use their fur, and we use their fat. It's called lanolin. They're very useful animals. In fact, they've kept us alive and warm for many, many, many centuries. I have no problem with playing around with them genetically. No, we're not playing God. We're actually trying to improve the sheep for our uses, at the same time improve the health of the sheep too. There's a guy who's he's looking at this plant. It's called a ground cherry. It's a it's it's a reddish fruit and has a papery husk. And people eat them and they're quite yummy. I've never had one, but I've heard they're really good. But you never see them in the grocery store because ground cherries don't all bloom at the same time. They don't fruit at the same time. They don't ship well. They don't store well. And so it's not like a commercially viable crop. But wait a second, the scientist said, we know the genes that influence tomatoes and pears and apples, and we know what genes influence flowering times and what genes influence fruit production. Now I could take a ground cherry and I could um, breed them for maybe 1,000 years or at least several centuries, and I could get a ground cherry that fulfills all of the necessary requirements of our modern grocery stores, or I could genetically engineer them in 1 year. The same changes that would have happened over centuries, and they would have happened eventually, those mutations would have occurred. Let's just do them today, and I will invent the ground cherry that a couple years from now I'm going to have farms producing these, and I'm going to invent another $1 billion crop. I see no problem with that, especially when you're considering that these are mutations that are going to happen naturally anyway. Now, where I draw the line, and it's a very strong line, it's a very bold line, it's a very clear line, is when we're talking about human beings. Because even though God gave Adam and Eve, and therefore as their descendants, us, the responsibility to have dominion over creation, he did not give us the right to have dominion over other human beings. Period. So we should not be genetically modifying human embryos because you're affecting a human being. You should not be genetically modifying embryos, because when that embryo becomes a human being, becomes a voting member of society, what if you made a mistake? Well, that person, that adult, had no ability to say, hey, don't do that to me. They don't have the ability to say yes or no on an experiment. Now, you can't do that. Now, if you want to take an adult who's not going to have any more children, and you want to say, hey, you know what, we can fix your gene for sickle cell anemia, or we can fix your diabetes, or we can fix Parkinson's. Fantastic, awesome, wonderful, do it, man. Give me one jab in the arm and I got new DNA, and all of a sudden I'm not going to have this disease anymore. That's really cool. In fact, economically, it'll be good for us because healthcare expenses will go down. It costs more money to take care of someone who's hurting than to fix them, maybe. But, and here's a big but, here's a big moral dilemma that the Christians have to face. 10 years from now, we go to the doctor, say, doctor, I got no cartilage in my knees. I can't walk. Oh, we can grow you new cartilage and we can give you an operation and put the cartilage in there. Oh, that sounds really cool. But who's going to think to ask, hey, doc, how many babies had to be aborted and how many embryos had to be destroyed in order to figure out how to do this? That's the moral dilemma that we face. And I don't know that there's an easy answer for that, because the embryologists have decided that they can experiment on whatever they want to experiment on. And as long as it doesn't come to term, they don't have any moral reasons to not do it. In fact, they have this thing called the 16-day window, where they feel free to manipulate human embryos as much as they want up to the 16-day window. That's the point at which you can't take an embryo and split it in half to make twins. And it's the point where the neural crest starts developing. That's going to become the brain and the spinal cord. And that's the primary organizational principle of the embryo, is that neural crest, and then our body is based on that. And so once it hits 16 days, oh no, that they can't do it anymore. But as long as they experiment before that, they can just flush it down the drain or incinerate it. And I'm sorry, this is gross and it hurts. And it's a major moral dilemma. And I don't see how science right now even cares. I don't see any real scientists saying, no, we shouldn't do this. But this goes all the way back to, and I don't want to get into politics so much, but there was a time when George W. Bush was president, and he made a ruling about stem cells, about embryonic stem cell lines. And it was a big kerfluffle, and there was all this arguing, all this debate in the media and in the public. And what he ended up saying was, all right, look, we already have these embryonic stem cell lines in existence. Don't make any more. But if you're working on it, feel free to continue to experiment on these lines, just don't make any more. And honestly, I was really disappointed with that. Um, that was just a moral decision where, yeah, on the one hand, it's already happened. So the moral dilemma is in the past. So if you're working on this, it's not like you killed that embryo. That's not like you went to that aborted fetus and pulled cells out. And the damage is already done. So let's just continue on. What he should have said was that, you know what, this is a moral problem, and it's a big moral problem. Tell you what, guys, here's $1 billion. Let's become kings of the world in adult stem cells. And let's not use any embryonic stem cells at all. And the whole problem would have gone away, and we would have had all these amazing scientific advances today, because honestly, just about all of the advances in embryonics comes from adult stem cells. I'm not aware of any fetal stem cells that have been used to bring about a cure or a new technology, but lots of them involved in adult stem cells. And so there's politics involved, there's morality involved, and it's a giant, huge mess. I say no to human cloning, and I say no to the experimenting on human embryos, because this is a very strong pro-life issue with very strong moral implications that scripturally are clear.
Now, you referenced the scriptures, the Word of God, as the baseline for everything that you said. And we agree. The Word of God places value on the human life. And so these last few questions from this strain, we're actually going to we're leaving the genetics now, we're leaving the science, we're kind of getting more into the theology. So you gave us a perfect bridge to transition. So on May 14th, 2017, you gave a talk called The Alternative: Creation's Competitive Edge. In your opening statement, you spoke about your scientific credentials and your career, but you said, and I quote, "The most important part of my life is that I am a follower of Jesus Christ." Why is being a follower of Jesus Christ important to you?
Well, first of all, the talk that you're referencing is a talk that I have given several hundred times. Uh, every CMI speaker has what we call a relevance talk. It's our Sunday morning sermon. And we all have one. They're all different. Every speaker does it a little differently, but there's about 30 speakers that we have in our different offices around the world. And we're going to give a relevance talk in about 12 or 1,300 churches just in the year 2020. This is what we do. We go around and we talk to audiences, usually in churches, about the Bible, about the gospel, about how it relates to creation. And it's a really important topic, we feel. And so, your listeners will be like, hey, how do I get that in my church? Just go to creation.com and hit the contact us button, and we can easily set you up. This is what I do. This is a huge part of my life is traveling and speaking at churches. I'm trying to encourage Christians in their walk and their understanding of the Bible. All right, now I just talked too much. Ask the question again. I'll answer it this time.
Sure. Why is being a follower of Jesus Christ important to you?
When a person meets the God of the Bible, everything changes. It's like in the Matrix, which pill are you going to take? You take that one colored pill, and all of a sudden, oh, you wake up to reality. Well, that is exactly what it's like when you're, mucking about in your prior life and you're not really paying attention to the spiritual side of things, and all of a sudden, the world changed. It's like in the Old Testament example when Elisha was stuck in a city called Dothan, and the besieging army was surrounding it, and his servant was afraid. And Elijah says, "Lord, open his eyes." And the servant sees the chariots of God on all the surrounding hills that he could not see before. That's what it's like when we meet Jesus Christ, and it changes everything. Therefore, the fact that I'm a Christian is the single most important part of my life. Now, I'm still a sinner. I am still very rebellious, and I still fight against God. I know that. I am far from perfect. In fact, some of my issues are glaringly obvious, especially because I'm a scientist. I like to say that scientists wear all their quirks on their sleeve. We walk around, everyone's like, "Wow, this guy's really odd." Well, yeah, it's just because of the way we are. Um, but even though I am a wretched person in many ways, I'm also a redeemed person in many ways, and I'm not nearly as bad as I could be, and not nearly as bad as I once was, because Jesus is slowly transforming me. Now, I also understand this transformation will be incomplete until the day I die, and I'm going to be grieving about this forever until that ultimate redemption comes. Now, I'm going to be living like with the rest of the Christians because of the biblical promise with Jesus forever in the heavenly realms, which I think is going to be a recreated earth without sin, without rebellion, without sickness, without disease. And I'm really looking forward to that. But that thought is transformative. It changes my approach to everything. And it makes me understand that my reason for existing is not only to glorify God, it's also to testify about God among the people who haven't heard about him or need to be encouraged. Even as people who don't even want to hear, there's sometimes that testimony can change a heart. That's why this is so important to me.
You actually gave a little bit of my next question's answer in the previous answer. Now, I wanted to ask you, because you work for CMI, so you were at Calvary Chapel, and you said you've been reading Creation Magazine since 1989. And you said you thank God for Creation Magazine because it was used to, you said, keep you in Christianity. And so how can the viewers of current topics in science get Creation Magazine?
It's very, very simple. Go to creation.com, scroll down, and there's a Creation Magazine link right there. It's really funny because creation.com is a really important piece of real estate on the internet. I mean, that's a great name. It's a very popular website. But we know that more people read our Creation Magazine than read our web articles. It's funny to say that in today's technological world where most print magazines and print publications are going by the wayside, but our magazine still goes out to over 110 countries. And we know how many tens of thousands of people subscribe to it. And we know that we get more testimonials of people saying, "Thank you for encouraging me," or even "I became a Christian reading your magazine," than anything we do online. There's something about a high quality, beautiful, nice pictures, nice layout magazine that I don't know. It's just different. In fact, I still read it. I mean, even though it's made in my office, and I share an office with one of the editors, and another editor is right next door, and they're talking. I mean, I get Creation Magazine. I still read it. I bring it with me on planes when I'm traveling because I'm not aware of every article in there, and I I just love it. It's just been so refreshing and so nice to read something like that, and so encouraging. And it's been encouraging me for 30 years now. In fact, I wasn't even a creationist when I signed up for it. Some friends at college had dragged me down. I think it was Wyuka Road Baptist Church in Atlanta. Way to go, Wyuka Road, wherever you are. Um, they dragged me down there, and I didn't really agree with the speaker because I was an evolutionist. And I don't know why, but I had $20 in my pocket. I think it's 25 or 29 now, but 31 years ago, I had $20 in my pocket, and I signed up for Creation Magazine. And it was weird because in that first magazine I brought back to my dorm room at Georgia Tech, I read something that I had learned about in biology class the day before. And I had no idea the Bible could even begin to answer it. And then the next page was something about geology I'd always wondered about. I was like, oh, the Bible can answer that too? I was shocked. And really, I think God used this little magazine to study me deeply into Christianity. It might have prevented me from falling away like so many of my other friends have done.
And hopefully now, viewers who are listening, if they go subscribe to the magazine, it'll boost their faith. And then if they share it with other people, it'll boost the faith of those that they shared it with. Now, speaking of testimonies, here's another question. Let's just say that there was a young man who did a public creation and evolution debate. Now, let's just say that he may have been in way over his head, or maybe not. Now, this young
Talking
man
about me?
said something. He said something in his closing statement that shocked some of his listeners. Now, let's just suppose that young man wants you to share your thoughts on what he said at the end of his debate. The young man said something to the effect of, I would encourage you all to turn to Jesus Christ, no matter how silly it seems. I can stand up here and make an absolute fool of myself. Do you realize that I just shot my scientific career? I bet I never get another scientific paper published for the rest of my life. All my hard work getting my education is probably dead, but it was worth it. Thank you. That's how that young man chose to close the debate. What are your thoughts on what he said?
I believe you're talking about the Great Dothan Creation Evolution debate. Um, I was we actually worked that through another ministry called American Vision. They had a supporter who was complaining that there was a guy in Dothan, Alabama, who was writing letters to the editor and interrupting church services. And they said, we need a guy to come and shut this guy down. So we set up a debate and we filled up the opera house. In fact, the fire marshal shut the doors. And about twice as many people were outside, including 2 buses that had driven up from Florida that got there too late. And so they just listened on radio and had a big party in the parking lot. But yeah, that was my first ever public debate. In fact, I was brand new in creation. I had been working for CMI maybe a year. I mean, I know so much more now than I did then, not only about the science, but also about how to discuss it, how to argue it, how to disembowel bad arguments. And in fact, I still see this guy's arguments today. Like, wait, that is so old. He's so easy to answer. We've already answered it so many times, but they still keep coming up. Um, I would do it again, and I would have done it again sooner after that. But I was so new. I had never been in debate. I never studied debating. I didn't even realize what it was. I thought it was just a bunch of people talking fast. Well, that's not true. But I did learn something important also, and that is the audience can usually not keep up with the debate. And what they're left with is an impression, a feeling, an emotion. And debates are more emotional than they are intellectual until you have time to sit down and analyze what was said and think through what was said. And that takes a long time. In fact, I mentioned, while I was on stage, I said some things based on authority that I didn't know were true, but I suspected they were true. And that's risky. You're not supposed to do that. But, I was new and I didn't know any better. Happily, all of those things have since come true. Science has validated my statements when I was going out on a limb and saying it. And it turns out I was right. So, okay. All right. So that's an explanation of the Great Dothan Creation Evolution debate, which we sold that DVD at CMI for at least 10 years. I'm not sure if we still sell it or not.
I got it on video download.
All right, video download still. Okay. What was the question you were trying to ask me about this?
The question was, what do you think about the way that you ended the debate?
Um,
You want me to read your full quote? Because I tweaked the quote because I wanted to see if you would remember it. Do you want me to read you the full quote?
if you like, go ahead.
Sure. So you said in closing, I would encourage you all, it's essentially the same thing, but I would encourage you all to turn to Jesus Christ, no matter how silly it seems. I can stand up here and make an absolute fool of myself. Do you realize that I just shot my scientific career? I bet I never get another paper published for the rest of my life. 8 years in a Ph.D. program at the University of Miami is probably dead, but it was worth it. Thank you. So now, what do you think of the way you ended the debate?
I would do it again. I got my degree because I wanted the bully pulpit. I knew that with those letters after my name, doors would open up and my ability to interact with the world would change. So I went and I slogged away all those years just to get my PhD. And it was worth taking it and saying, here, God, use it, and letting go of it. And it's true. I'll probably never get an appointment at any secular college to be a professor. And publishing is very difficult because I am known, so I have to be careful with what I write. But I have gotten 2 papers published since that time on genetics in evolutionary journals, even. But it's just difficult. Um, but as a Christian, everything belongs to God. So if for the young Christians out there who are considering getting a degree or something like that, you know what I say? I say go for it. Now, I resolved I wasn't going to lie about my beliefs in grad school, but I also said I'm not going to voluntarily commit suicide. If they ask me, I'll tell them, but nobody ever asked. I didn't lie. I just never volunteered. So now I got that degree and now I can use it. But had I, had to take one for the team, I think I would have done it. Had I been run out of grad school because some professor says, "Are you a creationist or are you an evolutionist? What do you actually believe?" Then I would have said it, and I probably would never gotten my degree. That's okay. It was all in God's hands. So we don't know where we're going in education when we're starting off. We don't know how far we're going to go, but we need to go as far as we can. Just because God's called us to be good at what we do and to work really hard, no matter what you do. And it just so happens that these doors opened up and I walked through them and they kept on opening until the final door and they let me at the other side. I was like, what? How did that just happen? And then when I was done, though, it was time to say, God, use this. Now, I didn't know how God was going to use it because I didn't know about CMI. It had a different name back in the day. But about a year after I got my doctorate, I'd moved back to Atlanta where I got my undergraduate because I had a bunch of friends up here. And I learned about this organization and I sent them an email and I got a phone call. I said, PhDs don't grow on trees. And they happened to have an office in Atlanta, which actually they didn't have an office in Atlanta. They had a P.O. box in Atlanta. They were just setting up their Atlanta office. I ended up being the first person I hired from the outside for their Atlanta office. And I cannot believe that that's how it worked out. But that's how it did work out. Only because I was willing to be used by God in the way that He wanted to use me. And I think I'm doing what God made me to do. All my strengths I can use as a speaker for Creation Ministries, and my weaknesses, I don't have to worry about them so much because the things that I'm good at doing, God's allowing me to exercise those strengths. And some of the weaknesses are coming along, like my ability to punctuate sentences and things like that. But it's an amazing place to take the gifts that God's given to you and to use them directly for the kingdom. I'm shocked. I can't believe it. I don't deserve it, and yet here I am. So I'm trying to help people. I'm trying to encourage people, and I would love it if other people jumped in and used their strengths, just like you're doing. I mean, you got this podcast or whatever you vlog or whatever you call this YouTube show, and you do all these other things online, and you're really good at it. And I keep saying, go for it, because if you're good at something, do it. If you're not good at anything, then just be a regular person, because you can still talk. You can still tell people about Jesus Christ. You can still use some of the things the brainiacs are making and figuring out and say, hey, this brainiac told me this. And you can still talk to other people about it. We can all be used by God in whatever capacity we find ourselves in. We don't have to be a big mouth like I am. You can be a calm, behind the scenes person doing work also, and you can still be working for the kingdom.
Amen. Now, you said that anyone can be used by God. Now, if someone's listening in the audience and they hear your quote, you said in the Dothan debate, you want people to turn to Jesus Christ. So for someone's listening and they've gone through this whole interview, they've heard everything you said, and now they're starting to feel maybe convicted by the Holy Spirit. And now they want to know, Dr. Carter, how do we give our hearts to Jesus Christ?
It's very easy. You just say, Jesus, take me now. Being a Christian, part of the massive difficulty with becoming a Christian is humbling yourself and giving yourself over to the God of creation, because human will and human ego doesn't want to do that. But that's the necessary step. Becoming a Christian means you're submitting yourself to God's rule for your life. It's not a bunch of rules like do this and don't do that. It's I want to honor God with my words and my thoughts and my actions. It's hard. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but I would wish it on everybody because I know that even if it's hard, it's a good thing. After that, though, you need help. You can't be a Christian by your own. You got to find a good church. You got to find good teachers. You got to find a support network. Because if you're swimming in the shark tank and you're the only little guppy, you got no hope, man. You're going to be eaten alive. But there are other guppies out there, and some of them are look like they're shark impervious. So find those people, learn from them. You have to plug into a community. I know, in the modern world with the internet, there's all these lone wolves out there, and you know what? The lone wolves just tend to get eaten up. So being a Christian is not just believing in God and not just believing in the God of the Bible. It's also interacting on the world stage with other Christians and non-Christians too. That's just my best advice I can give somebody.
Thank you so much. And that was our final question. Thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. Now, to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can find Dr. Carter's biography, resume, DVD talks, articles, website, podcast, and testimony in the description. Additionally, you'll also find a link to purchase both the book and the documentary Evolution's Achilles Heels. I cannot recommend that documentary enough, as God used that documentary to bolster my faith and confidence in His Word. Evolution's Achilles Heels is a 96-minute documentary and 272-page book with color diagrams and illustrations. The 15 Ph.D. scientists featured in Evolution's Achilles Heels masterfully tackle what are commonly associated with the strongest points of the evolutionary theory and systematically show how the evolutionary arguments are dead in the water or primordial soup. In the description, you will find a link that has been available to purchase the Evolution's Achilles Heels book and documentary pack for a discounted offer. Be sure to also subscribe to Creation Magazine. Follow the instructions that Dr. Carter gave and be encouraged by that tremendous faith-building resource. Science truly is the handmaid of religion, as the evidence for creation brings nothing but glory to God. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.